This is a Parshat podcast brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study, and I'm your host, Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. Let's learn. Welcome back to our Shmot series, First Principles of Nationhood, where we are exploring what axiomatic ideas sit at the root of Israel's national formation, without which we wouldn't be who we are. How might we adjust our current trends in the Jewish world to realign with these principles? For those of you who love listening weekly, sponsoring an episode is a wonderful way to show your gratitude for the high-level content we try and put out each week. Be in touch with us at podcast@matan.org.il or with the Matan office to sponsor the Shmot episodes. I will say that the episodes of the rest of the Book of Shmot are still available for sponsorship, so we'd love to hear from you. Parshat Yitro is one of Shmot's most monumental parshiot. It opens with the reunion of Moshe with the rest of his family and with his father-in-law Yitro and his wife and children. Yitro first listens to Moshe's recounting of recent miraculous events and then verbally recognizes God's greatness, demonstrating the exact Yidiyat Hashem, awareness of God, that God tried to instill in the Egyptians through the plagues. After this, following the true ways of the wise, Yitro observes Moshe's judiciary leadership and then offers unsolicited advice. Create a system of judiciary delegation to relieve Moshe from the burden of adjudicating over each case. This establishment of a human judicial system forms a moving introduction to the receiving of divine law on Sinai. The second half of the Parsha recounts the preparation for and receiving of the 10 commandments, the Aseret HaDibrot. Beautifully, Nechama Leibovitz explains that the phrase Yidiyat Hashem, repeated 10 times throughout the plagues, parallels the 10 Dibrot, enforcing the idea that the plagues functioned as theological preparation for the Israelites' acceptance of the commandments. This Parsha brings us deep into the second section of the Book of Shmot, which focuses on the covenant at Sinai, which of course begins with the Aseret HaDibrot, but continues with Parshat Mishpatim, and also afterwards. Back on the podcast is a Matan teacher, Rabbanit Nechama Goldman Barash, who teaches contemporary halacha and Talmud at Matan, at Pardes, as well as a Midrasha Torah V'Avodah. She is an active member of Beit Hillel and a graduate of Matan's Hilchata program. She's also the author of Uncovered, Women's Roles, Mitzvot, and Sexuality in Jewish Law. Nechama, it's a pleasure to have you back on the podcast.
It's really great being back, Yosefa.
We've had a lot of really beautiful conversations in the past, some of which I really have received many emails around those conversations. And we always sort of manage to both speak about something with relevance and also sort of do a dive both into the biblical material and also the halakhic material. And I know that our conversation today is going to do something similar surrounding one of the Aseret HaDibrot. And before we sort of dig deeper into the specific commandment that we're going to speak about today, first of all, I just wanted to say that I believe this is the first episode on Parshat Yitro that's actually, certainly in the past 2 years, that's really dug deep into the actual commandments themselves. In the past, I've focused more on the Yitro story, whether looking at the idea of the other who's sort of wise in Tanakh, or specifically at what was Yitro actually contributing, meaning what was unique or revolutionary about what he was suggesting to Moshe. But today, we really want to focus on the Aseret HaDibrot themselves. And so what's interesting is that we have these 10 commandments, which is the correct translation of diber, meaning they're not sentences, they're not mitzvot, meaning of course they will become mitzvot in the formalistic sense, but they seem to be very different from Parshat Mishpatim, which comes right after. And I guess the first question that I always sort of think about when it comes to the Aseret HaDibrot is, how are we supposed to frame them? Because are we framing them as the 10 most essential ideas in Judaism? Because I'm not sure I would sign off on that necessarily, meaning I definitely believe that that's true when it comes to Shabbat, and perhaps also Kibbutz Avim, and maybe Emunah b'Hashem, belief in God, if that even is what the first and second Dibrot are coming to try and say. But on a basic level, and we've spoken about this in the past, the Aseret HaDibrot certainly come to be a prologue to the Parshat Mishpatim, which is sort of more halakhic in the way that we're familiar with it. But I'm curious what you have to say about that, what you think about this idea of, are these supposed to be our 10 best hits? Are they supposed to be sort of bullet points for all the rest of Torah? How do you sort of frame this when you think about the Aseret HaDibrot?
So I really think that they're more of a preamble than something that is, the essential principles of faith or, even the most central ideas that are meant to guide us. And I think that's really underscored by Parshat Mishpatim, which comes right after with 60 plus much more distinct and detailed laws that have to do with both interaction between human beings and relationship with God, relationship with time. So I think the experience of revelation that comes with commandedness, comes with obligation towards God and towards fellow members of society, is an important opening for what's going to come after. And the idea that relationship with God is not going to just be God saying, here I am God, and you must obey me, must submit to me, but it's going to come with some very detailed expectations of what it means to be in relationship with God and with community. So I think there's a preamble here, an introduction, and it's not just going to be a spiritual experience or an overwhelmingly theological experience of seeing and feeling God. It's going to come with really an expectation of behavior in addition to belief. So I think that's very dominant in the 10 commandments. And of course, the number 10 is it's a nice number. It's a round number. It's a number that divides into 5 and 5, which when we think of the tablets and how they're written, there's something visually very appealing about it. We're not going to have time to really go through, or we've chosen to focus on one commandment rather than on the structure of the 10. But if we had time to go through the 10 commandments, we would see there's organizing principle around why these 10 and how they're structured. But I think it's most important to recognize these really are just an introduction to what is going to become a lifelong relationship with God through the expectation of certain behavior.
A few thoughts in response. First of all, is that there's a tremendous debate whether there actually are 10.
Yes.
We have decided traditionally that there's 10, but also there are many Rishonim who think that there are 12 or 13. There's a tremendous question how to divide up the first few sentences in the Aseret HaDibrot, which I think makes sense because, as you said, it really is a preamble. And again, that I've gone back to it so many times, the importance of recognizing that this is a treaty system and that the treaty has a preamble, has a historical preamble to it. We've spoken about that very often regarding to, the suzerain treaties and, different conversations I've had with or about, let's say, Josh Berman, a lot of his research that he tries to put out and make really part of the common understanding of this part of the Torah. A piece that you said, I think even our daily tfisa, our daily understanding of this is so clear and agrees with what you said, because we do not recite the Aseret HaDibrot, right? That's not part of a Jewish education. Nothing in the way that we relate to these mitzvot reflect that they are more important, so to speak, than anything else that comes afterward. Right. It's not like, I would say almost embarrassingly, I'm not even sure that every 7-year-old would know all the Aseret HaDibrot by heart. They would know, by the way, the 10 plagues, because that makes it into such a key moment of our year in a way that the Aseret HaDibrot does not. Meaning, if it was to be seen as the foundational principles, or these are the most important mitzvot, if you do these 10, you're okay, then it would make its way into, let's say, the Sheva mitzvot b'nei Noach, but it doesn't, right? Or it would make its way into that thing that we have kids memorize. And it's not the thing that we have kids memorize, which I think is so interesting in that, and I want to go back to the piece you said about revelation, because I think that that's such an important piece, is that when we get to Parshat Mishpatim, when we get into the nitty-gritty details, we're going to feel like we've kind of almost come down, so to speak, from something that's very high and transcendent. And I think that one of the main ideas that comes through from the whole Ma'amad Har Sinai, if less so from the content of what's said, is that our life will be about aspiring to a life of Kedusha. It'll be about aspiring to some sort of connection with God through our daily interactions, mostly with other people and not with God as an entity. But the experience of revelation, certainly for this first generation that's receiving the Torah, that we were not, we don't merit having every year again, is sort of that moment where they touch upon this thing that they actually don't want to keep being in contact with afterwards because it's so overwhelming, but it serves as like an eternal reminder of the thing that we're searching for. It's the thing that we're aspiring to try and grab onto through doing all these very regular daily mitzvot. And I think that piece of revelation here, it seems to almost trump in the end the content. Do you know what I'm saying? Meaning we'll learn about Shabbat more importantly from the Mishkan.
Yes.
And of course we speak about Shabbat and the mitzvah that's given for Shabbat and Aseret HaDibrot, but it's not that we give precedence to the Aseret HaDibrot over when it's repeated in the Dibrot in Devarim, and then when it comes up in the context of the Mishkan. And I think that that's such an interesting piece, that like Torah doesn't give precedence to any mitzvot over the others, even when they're the ones that are given in utter revelation.
And you see that, tefillin were found from the Second Temple period down by the Dead Sea, and they had the 10 Commandments in them. And then that disappears, and we just leave Shema. And I think that there is a concern that preferencing in some way the 10 Commandments will give more weight to those 10 over others that are equally important. And I think throughout the Torah, there are just these myriad mitzvot that we're meant to understand are being held in relation to another. One that I wanna speak about, and maybe we'll get to, is Shiluach HaKan, which is sending away the mother bird. The reward for that is long life. The reward for honoring father and mother, which is one of the 10 Commandments, is also long life. Now, this baffles commentaries, because sending away the mother bird is a really easy mitzvah, as long as you don't fall out of the tree. And
I laugh, but it's a sugya in the Gemara as well.
It's a sugya in the Gemara that you could fall out of the tree.
Yeah.
But if you don't fall out of the tree, or you find the nest on the ground, then everyone recognizes this is a ridiculously easy mitzvah for which you're being promised this incredible reward, adjacent to honoring parents, which is an incredibly difficult mitzvah. And some of the medievalists say that, and it's really based on the Yerushalmi, that's to remind us, kal v'chomer, that the Torah wants us to understand that even easy mitzvot come with reward adjacent to difficult mitzvot, and not to start doing the preferencing of, I'm only going to get reward for these difficult mitzvot, so I'll focus on those. No, the easy mitzvot, the low-hanging fruit, are also important in terms of the regularity of commitment and observance, and no less or more than the more difficult ones.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Again, we're going to move now on to honoring parents, but there seems to have been a concerted effort put into not creating preference of certain mitzvot over others. Now, of course, you and I know that on a lay level, on a colloquial level, of course, there are mitzvot that have had more mazal than others, and that have become sort of defining features of Judaism over time. Yes. But the Torah itself, and definitely agree with you, also definitely we see very immediately in the earliest commentaries, really try and keep that very far at bay. And so the experience of revelation becomes really a foundational moment in Am Yisrael, but it's a lot less about the content than it is about that experience itself. So, okay, that's a fascinating way to just start thinking about this topic. I think there's much more that we could say, but I know that we want to get today to the conversation about honoring parents, which, if I can even just say as a non-Torah sourced opening, as you've already hinted to, it's a very difficult mitzvah. And it's a mitzvah that seems to be one that actually gets more difficult as we age. The responsibilities for taking care of parents becomes greater as they get older. And we're living in a world where also parents are living much longer. Meaning, I think this mitzvah has shifted tremendously in the modern era, where the amount of years for which people are shouldering the responsibility for helping aid, guide, and support their parents is much, much greater than it was even less than a century ago. So I think that this mitzvah has always had very important contour and been really fleshed out by Chazal and through a lot of responsa that we'll look at. But just on a basic fact of years and what care looks like for parents as they get older, it's a mitzvah that's really shifted in the past century as lifespans have extended. So
I actually want to go back. We'll come to that. That's maybe a little later in the conversation. I think where it's gotten complex, and really I'm going to bring a tshuva from the 16th century, so I want to make clear that it's not unique. And the Talmud already talks about parents who disagree with their children's choices. And I think what makes it complex is that once we individuate, right, we grow up with our parents, and there's definitely a little bit of we're very dependent on our parents when we're young for support, for love, for affection, for direction, for education. And then we begin to reach adulthood. That's when there begins to be clashing, because the child begins to individuate. The child begins to recognize they are distinct from parent, and then there is disagreement, and there's a jockeying for a sense of self that creates what we know in the teenage years, a lot of clashing and arguing and tension, and sometimes over stupidity, but really it's the child trying to define themselves as something distinct, and some parents deal with that better and some less well. But then you reach adulthood, and there begin to be myriad choices about profession, about place of living, about marriage. And here too, there begins to be, and often is, complexity and conflict as to what happens when the child makes different choices. So well before we get to the aging parent, which is, as you said, a reflection of modern medicine and our ability to live much longer, it also touches, though, on parents and children don't live close to one another, that geographically we're often very distant. Those who are listening to the podcast and either have parents or children in Israel, for instance, something that a parent hopefully supported if their child chose to make Aliyah because of the wonderful values in education and camp and Zionism. And then suddenly you have this geographical distance that's going to make the ability to honor and care for much more complicated. And that touches on, as I said, in your 20s, you begin making decisions about profession, about where you're going to live, about marriage, that may create, chas v'shalom, it can create a rift, but sometimes it can just create physical distance that also then impedes the ability to carry out in a direct way this mitzvah.
So two thoughts. One is that I just want to mention also, and I don't exactly know what to do with this, Nechama, but we only have 2 out of the 10 commandments that are positive commandments.
Yes.
Shabbat and kivud avim. All of the rest, again, I'm going to leave out the first as a sort of a joker, right? The first is a little bit complicated. How we look at it is a belief in God, okay? But the rest all begin with lo, or they are a negative commandment. And we have Shabbat and kivud avim, which sort of sit in the middle, and then number 6, let's say, that are positive commandments, which, by the way, I don't know what to do with that, but maybe we'll keep that in the back of our mind when we look at some of the more halakhic aspects here, which is that this is a part of our life that we want to try and keep as positive as possible. It's not a thing we want to stay away from. It's a thing that we want to keep close. Just like when people tell me about their Shabbatot, one of the things I'll ask specifically as an educator is, you can do all the lo ta'asehs of Shabbat. You can refrain from all those things. But what your Shabbat looks like is a lot about what you do on Shabbat. Yeah. And I think also when it comes to these topics of whether it's parenting and children, at being a child, you're saying kibbud avim, really, there's weight to both of those sides, both the parent and the child, right? And obviously those roles get flipped over time sometimes in ways that could be bittersweet or even just what is. But I feel like I take with me, just as like almost like a life lesson before we even begin and talk about the complexities of it, that this is something that we want to put in our best efforts, that it remain something that is positive. It's a what you do and not what you don't do.
I feel like we're going to be going back and forth between the biblical text and modernity, because really honoring parents and Shabbat observance are so central to our understanding of time and space and relationship. But I do want to quote Leon Kass. He says 2 things where he links together these 2 mitzvot. I think he says it very well, because in his book, Founding God's Nation, Reading Exodus, he does a wonderful summing up and analysis of the whole structure of the 10 Commandments. But I'm just going to read a passage where he sums up the 2. The injunction to honor father and mother constitutes a teaching not only about gratitude, creatureliness, and the importance of parental authority. It insists on sacred distance, respect, and reverence, precisely to produce holiness, kedusha, in that all too intimate nest of humanity that often becomes a den of iniquity and a seedbed of tragedy. Now, what he's doing there is seeding us back to the book of Bereshit, where there are all these very, not just complicated, but morally problematic relationships between parent and child. And he's saying that this commandment comes in stark contrast to other law codes in the ancient Near East, where there's an emphasis on honoring leaders and heroes and those who reach certain benchmarks of success. And it brings it into the family structure, which is not about heroism and is not about monetary success and power, but it's about this very regular familiar
it's not
relationship.
Earned. A
It's
parent
not earned.
does not
Yes.
need to earn their child's respect. That it just is. And
It just
is.
And he says words like love and obedience are not what is used here. The words are kavod and yirah, one in Shemot and then later again in Dvarim. And this idea of honoring, there's distance, there's an equality, there's looking up to one another with respect and reverence and fear. And there's a mimicking of relationship with God, which also demands that kind of distance, even as you're also looking for ahavat Hashem, right? Yeah. Love is I would like to think built into the relationship in the most healthy way, but what's sometimes less easy to facilitate or achieve is some of the distance in such an intimate relationship, and that too is necessary. And then what he goes on to say is Shabbat observance offers a correction against the especially Egyptian penchant for human mastery and pride that culminates in despotism and slavery. So both of them are corrections against, and as a result, they're not in the negative, they're in the positive, because they demand something action-based in order to facilitate that kind of correction. And adherence to these teachings offers the best chance for vindicating the high hopes the world carries for the creature who is blessed to bear the likeness of divinity. I really love that. And it's meant to be very empowering and aspirational and carry us not just into what we can't do and what we have to avoid, but what we can do, what energy we can kind of breathe into the world that reflects this likeness of divinity in the best possible sense.
As you read the description from Leon Kass, I both am reflecting on how it's hitting me right now and how it must have hit the original generation that received this. And aside from all of these pieces, which are, also in the plagues themselves, we're supposed to sort of counter the ancient Egyptian belief system. I even just think of the surprise that the original nation had when all of a sudden they're kind of lambasted with all of these commandments. Yeah. It really was, we're used to it. We know, again, those of us who are in the religious community, we're familiar with the fact that there are a lot of injunctions in this religion. But I'm sort of just imagining them receiving this in that generation, and they had a little bit of a promo when they had to bring the Korban Pesach, and the word Bait and the centrality of the home is what's highly emphasized there. And really emphasizing the fact that they're all supposed to be in this together. But this is taking that piece to another level. It's saying it's not just about your lovely meal that you're sharing together. It's not just about everybody digs in together. We're taking care of our family. We may be taking care of our neighbors as well. But that there is something that is objectively higher in terms of order. Meaning the bait, that homeostasis is what we're aspiring for. But within that homeostasis, there has to be somebody or two people that are at the helm of that. And in order for this structure to work, there has to be a baseline of respect. As I said, it doesn't need to be earned. It's not their right of having brought you into this world is that there has to be this base. It doesn't have to be love, it doesn't have to be appreciation, although we hope deeply that both of those will happen. But there has to be this respect in that system. And I think that it's creating an order that maybe they were familiar with, as you said, from like leaders or, powerful people. But here we're saying it's the parents who has to have that. The Torah continually denudes all leadership roles from having much weight. Later it'll happen with the king, but it's the parent who has that role. And as you said, it's utterly complex because we also have a love and a chemla and a rachamim that's implicit in the relationship. But here we're saying there also needs to be something else at that baseline, which has to be there no matter what.
So now I want to shift a little bit because we're talking about from child to parent, and something we alluded to earlier in the podcast was, the complexity of what happens when parents demand of their adult children or emerging adult children choices in the name of honoring the parents. And I want to bring a tshuva. There's a really great tshuva, and really, before I even bring this tshuva, already, the Gemara says that a son does not have to listen to his parents if they disagree with his choices of where to live, what job to take, and who to marry. So the halakha comes in, and on one hand, we're going to uphold this as central to our awareness of relationship with God, of this is in the 10 commandments. It is very fundamental and foundational, all of those things. And if you go into Masechet Kiddushin, which is where a lot of the conversation around Kibud Av V'Im is situated, you're going to see that they recognize the power dynamic there, and that for adult children, there are independent choices that need to be made, and that parents can sometimes contribute their wisdom and at times can torpedo what should be the right choice for that parent. The complexity of that relationship is so paramount in those sugyot, so much so that actually halakhic codes struggle a little to give definition to what this needs to look like. What does it mean to honor? What does it mean to fear? And so they go to maybe the more obvious. You stand up when your parent comes into the room, or you don't sit in your parent's seat. If your parent asks for something like a cup of water, you go and you bring it to them. But okay, those are very, very small examples. How does it, what else is there? Do I have to spend money on my parents if they need to be financially supported? Well, largely the halakhic response is no, you don't have to spend your own money. Do I have to give up my job to care for my parents? Well, you need to make sure your parents are cared for, but that doesn't mean you actually have to be the one caring. And so it speaks to the complexity of, on one hand, this is foundational and it's in the 10 commandments. On the other hand, there's almost a reluctance to script it in the way that Shabbat is going to become scripted, or the way that monetary obligation when it comes to owing people money or loans and tort law and so on is going to be scripted.
Just one piece there, which is that there's also always going to be such a big difference between mitzvot that are ritualized, like Shabbat,
right,
which are easier and less emotionally complex to make scripted than mitzvot that are ben adam lechavero, because I think the halacha recognizes, while it's going to give us over time specific halacha guidelines, it recognizes that it must be subject to the diversity of humanity in a way that Shabbat observance or kashrut even doesn't necessarily need that same diversity at its root. Meaning, of course, every mitzvah observance has to meet different realities, but at its root, there is something so much more complex and dynamic because we're dealing with humans here and not about a human's relationship to a ritualized mitzvah. Right? I think that's also in piece.
Yes.
But can you also just speak to the gender difference? Because this is very significant
absolutely.
here. Yeah.
So we have a Mishnah in Kiddushin that says, Anashim and Nashim are chayavim, when it comes to mitzvot that children have to do for parents, based on the pasuk, Ish aviv v'imo tira'u, right? We have a singular, but then it becomes plural, and it includes women. And here's the caveat, until they get married. And once a woman is married, although this is a rabbinic decision, they are exempted from honoring parents, with the understanding that to create tension in the marital home, with the woman being pulled between parents' home and husband's home, is going to be destructive, potentially destructive or toxic. And so a woman is essentially exempted from duties towards mother and father in a way that a son is not. I will add, though, because this is an important side note, in chapter 7 of the Mishnah in Ketubot, if a husband does not allow his wife to go home to visit her parents regularly, that is also grounds for divorce. They recognize the potential for toxicity in both directions. The idea that a woman could end up caught between her parents' home and her husband's home will create a tension in the household that will not be productive to Shalom Bayit. But they also understand that if a husband denies his wife the ability to go visit her parents, that's also crossing boundaries towards toxicity and abuse.
Yeah, and also traditionally a woman left her home.
Yes.
So it's very difficult to categorically commit her to honoring in all these mitzvah kind of ways because she wasn't physically going to be available. They didn't have a phone or internet so that she can organize their doctor's appointments from afar. So meaning that also makes sense on a practical level. Like, we must relieve her of that burden because it'll be very difficult for her to situationally fulfill them.
Yeah, so Rav Melamed in his Peninei Halacha will cite that. He will say, yes, that is still the halacha, and he will then wonder, he will say, obviously a woman who is able to and desires to should be should be not just allowed to, but should be encouraged to, and certainly even questions what it would look like in a marriage if a husband did not allow his wife to. So the halacha remains consistent, and Rav Melamed, in his way, recognizes the shift in modernity towards the ability for women to continue doing what is so important to them, or they may want to do, and mentions that. Sons, in contrast, are continuously commanded, regardless of marital status, and that makes it sound like, oh, does a son have to drop everything when his parents call and make demands on his time or on his fidelity towards them? And that also can create tension, of course, of shlom bayit. And there's a tshuva I want to bring. I've mentioned it already. Now I'm going to cite it in the 16th century. It's in Greece, and I want to credit Gerald Blitzstein. I found it in a source that he brought through Elliot Melamed's source sheet. A question was put to Rabbi Eliyahu Kapsel of Crete. We see in the Talmud that a man ought not to marry a woman who does not please him, so that when the father commands his son not to marry this woman, it's as though he commands him to violate the Torah. It's a situation where a father is forbidding his son to marry the woman he loves. And the tshuva comes out and says that is absolutely unreasonable. And if he obeys his parents and marries a woman he does not love, we're going to see the growth of hatred and strife in the home. And then the Tzitz Eliezer and the Avnei Tzedek, I really should have started with the Avnei Tzedek who comes before, and then the Tzitz Eliezer both bring situations where young women come and they want to marry men that are their parents protest, and both of them essentially call out and are concerned that parents are interfering where they should not. But that's also delicate, Yosefa, because sometimes parents see something in the potential partner that the child does not see. So these are such, nuanced and complex and gray areas of when is a parent overstepping their boundary of authority, when is the child not seeing something the parent is seeing, and it's in the best interest of the child. And I feel like the tshuvas really reflect that, so much so that I had a student once come talk to me, an older gentleman, who said that his mother had forbade him to marry the woman he loved, and he went to talk to his Rosh Yeshiva, who, after hearing him through and understanding the situation, told him he could reject his mother's injunction because this was his life. And that's where rabbinic guidance can sometimes be really essential, especially rabbinic guidance from men and women who are trained in some form of counseling, pastoral counseling, recognize the complexity of both the family and of what is happening with the child as they move towards independence. But you see it in the tshuvas.
I think also, interestingly, right, Tzitz Eliezer writes that any intelligent person can easily see that good manners and breeding would indicate that all daughters and also sons should consult with their parents regarding marriage. And this is indeed usually the case. But he says, but when they've had conversations and there's respect, but they don't agree with it, then there's no opposition in halakha, right? In order for you to make your own choice.
Yes.
And I think that's an important rounding out of this idea. And I think another piece that's also so significant, Nechama, is that when we say, kaver et avicha v'et imecha, there seems to be, at least in the idealized sense, this idea that parents will be functioning with their full faculties and will be people who both love and also respect and also have boundaries. And of course, in the reality of life is that not all parents are going to reflect that kind of ideal. And so even without getting into the idea of a toxic relationship, which I know we'll touch upon, but as you said, parents have their own perspective on something, a child has their own perspective on something, and we won't ever really be able to say that either of them has the full picture. And so ultimately, the Tzitz Eliezer says, of course, you should take your parents' thoughts into consideration and should feature in this decision. I will say to you, by the way, that what fascinates me is teaching couples today is that so often I'll teach a couple and I'll say, okay, so very often they'll say now, they've all spent plenty of time in the home of the other. So they've met the other's parents. But what's fascinating to me is, and I'm not going to lie, the same thing happened with my marriage, but that the parents only meet once the children have already decided to get married.
Right.
And there's something very, and I did that, okay? But there's something very odd about that, I find. I find now, thinking about my own child doing that and, X number of years, of that being a very weird thing. That meaning, of course, I want to have met the person and get to know them, but the fact that like the families don't ever really know each other until they've already chosen to enmesh themselves eternally is something to me that seems kind of jarring and different than, of course, in a more Haredized system, where the parents are doing much more of the vetting beforehand and they've checked that all out. There's something, I don't live in that space, but there's something very jarring about the way that it does function, that the parents are really very marginalized for the vast majority of it. It's a big shift, and I'm not sure what I think about it. I have a few years to think about it more, but yeah.
Having married off one child, and I have a second child who's getting married, it is a relief when you meet the parents and you're like, oh, these are lovely people,
yes.
and I don't have what to worry about. And we don't want to overly romanticize the Haredi model, because there too, things don't always get caught. I know you're not, but you're correct that they're much more involved at an earlier stage, and the children then rely on their parents for having done that kind of vetting, and
sometimes solely relying on their parents. Meaning, I have friends deep in the Haredi world, and I just find that very, very interesting. That meaning, this sentence to them of the Tzitz Eliezer, of course, they're discussing it with their parents. And then I'll meet other young people that I really teach more in the world that I'm engaged in, and there's a lot less conversation. And it's interesting.
And that speaks to the shift in the parent-child relationship.
Yeah.
I will, another segue is towards something you brought up, the question of toxic relationships, which we're not going to have time to really go into, but I have gotten questions, and I'm sure you have or you will, about, do I have to honor parents who are toxic, even abusive? And largely there's been a rabbinic shift towards understanding more about toxic and abusive parents, which I think is very modern and is not new. I don't think over 3,000, 4,000 years of history, there have been parents who have not been good parents, unfortunately, and so on. But I do want to say something, an important caveat that Dov Linzer wrote, because there have been a few articles in the last number of years, Rabbi Mark Dratch, Rabbi Dov Linzer, who, and not only, even more to the right, moving into the Haredi community, of acknowledging that there are parents who are bad parents, and then what does that do to the honoring thy parents, and giving children more latitude in avoiding being in relationship with toxicity or with harm. Absolutely. But then Dov Linzer, and this is very reflective of Rabbi Linzer, he writes a follow-up where he says that he heard from parents after he had written an article basically saying that children who have been brought up in abusive homes have the ability to disengage or disentangle from that relationship and are not bound by the kibud of commandment, then says, he heard from parents that this language of abuse has become reflexive when sometimes there are difficult relationships, and concerned that in the world
of... Can I just say overused? Is that what you mean?
Yes,
it's become overused. Yeah.
Yes. And he writes that, people wrote to him that they felt his essay could be used by some as a justification to avoid doing the necessary work to actually address the issues internally and between them and the parent. That could be harmful to the parent. It could be harmful to the adult child as well. And he writes, this critique is well placed. And a major part of the problem was I did not define what constitutes emotional abuse and so on. And then he writes, relationships are messy, and even painful ones are not necessarily abusive. Mm-hmm. And so throughout this podcast, we've been talking about the difficulty of defining a few things, defining exactly what the commandment requires and entails, defining the difference in gender. Well, what does that mean? A woman gets married and she's not bound by a commandment that's in twice repeated in the 10 commandments, and we've said is so foundational, but because of the complexity of marriage, and like you said, geographically, a woman would have moved away. Even though the pasuk says a man will leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, he remains very much situated within the parental relationship, and she doesn't. Not something that's so obvious or easy to understand, certainly today. And then we've moved into these relationships are so messy, and psychology and psychologists and therapy today have encouraged people to really delve into their primal attachments and their relationship with their parents. But sometimes the takeaway goes too far to another extreme, which is I'm just going to cut off my parents. And that too is not exactly where we want to. We want to protect children. We want to protect parents, but we sometimes err too much in spaces that are too far afield and too alienating. And so we should remember, I'm going to continue with one more quote from Dov Linzer, that together with putting great weight on protecting oneself, the Torah puts great weight on telling someone how they have pained you, being open to the other's remorse and repentance, so as to leave the door open to reconciliation. And I would like to end on that note with incredible sensitivity to sometimes that's not possible.
Right. I think that, first of all, I just want to say that there's a really great 1840 episode where they had it with someone who I believe was a therapist, but I think they also had a rabbinic perspective there. I'm forgetting the exact details, but it was an episode that was exactly about this, about cutting off relationships between parents and children, which has become, unfortunately, much, much, much more common, apparently, in the past decade. And this idea of everybody needs to live their best life, to be authentic, and to say the things they need to say. And a relationship that's negative or brings negative energy is one that sort of can basically get thrown out because it's not bringing good, karma into my life. I'm obviously making a more extreme case, right? Then it's obviously more nuanced than that. But we have many, many cases of a younger generation today that is cutting off from parents. In many cases, that probably wouldn't fall into this example of being toxic in a way that is impossible to reconcile. Right. And I think that I'm just putting that piece on the table. I thought it was a really illuminating episode, also to understand the extent of this phenomenon. Unfortunately, I've seen it in a little bit farther away within family structures, and it's really terrible. And I think that when we're dealing with people that are by and large healthy people, but like many have their blind spots, we all do, that this question of how do we go about reconciling, which definitely takes much more time, more work, and very often to get to a result that is nowhere near satisfying, but at least can be livable, is one that maybe we might say is a bit of a Torah value even to that regard. Yeah. I think also what you're speaking about too, these different halakhic situations, keeps going back to this truth, which is that it's very difficult to create what we consider to be formalistic halakhic definitions regarding a non-ritualized mitzvah. There's so many examples of mitzvot like this, but we have simanim shlemim in the Shulchan Aruch to define what is bikur cholim. But what I want to say, Nechama, and I hope that you're okay with this as a halachist, is that I find that more often than not, when people are trying to fulfill these mitzvot that are non-ritualized, they're not really consulting a halachic manual. Yeah. Meaning there's a lot here of this is a value, this is a mitzvah. They'll first often say it's a value, and then they'll also remember that it's a mitzvah, quote unquote. But most of us are not opening up our halachic guides or code books before we go make a visit in a hospital. Meaning the question of what does halacha have to say about these mitzvot, I find often tends to be somewhat tangential until it comes to an extreme case like we have here. I'm curious what you think about that. I'm speaking here on a lived experience level. I don't have research to back up what I'm saying. But just like I always joke, if people would read the simanim about kivud aveim in the Shulchan Aruch, we don't do half of what it says. We don't necessarily. I can never interrupt my parents in the middle of their sentence. Right. We don't do those. Right. We don't do those things, and it points to a much more complex question, which is what is halacha that bounds and what is halacha that guides. But it's just something that I often think about specifically in regards to kivud avim, because we'll be so davik. We'll cling onto every word of another siman of the Shulchan Aruch that we feel that the halachic world feels is critically important. When it might be great if we would a little bit let some of the pieces go and be a little bit more open regarding those issues, but it'll come to mitzvot that are the non-ritualized mitzvot that will be much less stringent about every word of the halacha that has been crystallized over the generations.
So, first of all, kashrut is a great example of how we have what is the word we're so immersed in the details. Yeah. Sometimes, you lose sight of the forest because all you see is a tree and every leaf on the tree. And that has become a place that, like you said, ritualized mitzvot allow for a kind of
formalistic
immersion.
Yeah.
And I'm not coming to question anyone's kashrut standards, but certainly that's a place where you see a lot of particular focus and leaning in, and sometimes feels like it's gone too far. I want to quote something. You asked this idea of interrupting your parents or not having a debate with your parents. Like, there are all sorts of things that are very limiting in the relationship in order to foster what Cass says is distance, is inequality, is reverence, is fear. The Shulchan Aruch already anticipates that and says as follows: if a father is moche babein, right, al kvodo, largely a father could be moche al kvodo, and that would be a mother as well. Like, parents have the ability to relinquish some of the more formal aspects of what is defined as honor and fear, and I appreciate that. The awareness that sometimes the honor and fear as defined, certainly by codes of law that are thousands of years old, where the parent-child relationship really was a more distant relationship, there's already an awareness that that's not going to work for every relationship, and that people have to have the ability to make choices that reflect their lived experiences with one another. And so, we've paid maybe a price for being mocha al kavod, for relinquishing some of the honor and the reverence. But what we've gained is often loving closeness and the ability to not just consult with parents, but share with parents. This is such a great opening, so thank you, Yosefa. What I'm seeing today a lot of, and this has really been over the last 30 years, and you see a shift in the last few, children who make different choices, children who become Haredi, or children who go out when the family is not, or children who go off the derech when the family is religious. You're seeing a lot of parents make Herculean efforts to maintain closeness with their children, despite the pain, despite the perhaps sadness that the child has chosen a different lifestyle. And that is saying, look, yes, I know the model is, you have to respect me. But what happens if I demand respect and all that does is push you away? What have we gained here? And so I want to call out with admiration the hard work in both directions that happens with children who have parents who sometimes are unreasonable, not abusive, but unreasonable, difficult, inflexible, and so on. And parents who are willing to see their children as having individuated and saying, look, that relationship, what the Ten Commandments talks about, does not only put the onus on one side, it recognizes that we as parents have given birth to these children and also have a responsibility to make sure the relationship is sustainable and feasible and continuous. And so I think that also has shifted a lot, where the idea that parents, I've heard many parents say, well, why don't they respect me? Why don't they come home and just stay for the whole Shabbat? Why aren't they being respectful? So that already holds a power dynamic where the child might say, look, I don't want to disrespect you, but then I'm not going to come home for Shabbat. And the parent wants it all. They want the child to come home for Shabbat, and they want them to respect them the way they want to be respected. And where I've seen parents be most successful is a softening of the rigidity of this framework, which the Shulchan Aruch already says a parent can do. It doesn't allow the child to soften, right? The child has to continue. But if the parent says, no, we're going to change the rules a little bit because I'm going to be mocha my kavod, so we can allow more room for love and for respect through the love I'm showing you. Wow, that's an amazing, amazing place. And I want to give credit to the halacha, to the codes, for allowing a softening in the parent-child relationship on a needs-be basis. And that allows parents and children to have more honest conversations. And so that child who might be driving on Shabbat might be the child that when the parent, lo aleinu, gets older and needs care, is going to be the first one to step up because they feel their parent has loved and respected them despite the painful difference in lifestyle. And so you can never know. And sometimes it's the child who is most bound by halacha, and the kashrut standards and the Shabbat standards in the home are impeccable, and then surprisingly is not able to uphold the value of kibud av when the parent is most in need.
Are we seeing that reflected also in halakhic language, or it's more just modern reflections of parents in the last, 30 years that this topic has been more greatly spoken about? I'm just curious.
So I think this idea of ha'av can be mochal kvodo already speaks to what the more...
No, but specifically the issue of children choosing a different religious or life path that is less congruent with their parents' value system, meaning that's just more being spoken about by modern people reflecting on their experience. Are we seeing also a rabbinic conversation with those ideas?
So I'll quote something in Sanhedrin because I think this is helpful. Ben Sora umore sheratzu aviv v'imo limcholo mochalin lo. Right now, that's not talking about the kibud av part. This is saying a parent has a Ben Sora umore. If the parents choose to forgive him, he can be forgiven. Right, and that leads. I'm going to quote Rivka Kahn in an article she wrote in the Jewish Week. Kahan, sorry. I think that this halacha conveys that as long as a forgiving relationship exists between parents and children, the future remains wide open. If the father and mother can continue to express love and forbearance for their child, there is no basis for gloomy assumptions about his or her future, no matter what the child has done in the past. She's commenting on that passage in Sanhedrin.
Sure.
So I do think there is halakhic language about this, and there's been a lot that has been written about this in the last, I would say, decade, as this phenomena just exists in the Haredi world, in the Hasidic world, in the modern Orthodox world, and so I think that, thankfully, I think there are sources that we can rely on in both directions, parent to child, child to parent. That perhaps is the deep truth of our sources, the insightfulness of our sources, that we create a framework that moves with us as we move into more modern situations that really are not modern. Maybe I'll just end with a Shem Mishmuel that I found in Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson, and this is the message I want to give. When the son feels the love inherent in his parents' willingness to forgive him despite all of his misdeeds, this keeps him connected to his roots. And since his roots are so deep and sacred, there is now strong hope that he will find the ability to transform himself. We're dealing with a parsha that's about the transformation of a nation into a community that is directed towards seeking and fulfilling the word of God. Forgiveness is a big part of it. Being able to forgive ourselves, being able to forgive those that we are in relationship with, sometimes being able to forgive God, kiviyachol, but I'm going to say that, becomes an important moment in our ability to reach the other side of that experience of the pain we sometimes feel, the hurt, the betrayal, the anger, and I think Kibud Av Ha'emet is an important place, an important mitzvah for us to think both about what the mitzvah asks of us, what we ask of the mitzvah, and the idea of forgiveness when it comes to these close relationships.
Nechama, I really want to thank you for being here today, for doing a deep dive on one mitzvah of the Aseret HaDibrot that has, always been relevant. Chazal have always been thinking about the complexities of this mitzvah, and as we saw, it's well reflected in the sources. I just want to say that I know this topic likely speaks personally to many people listening, and so if anybody would like any of the sources we've mentioned, or there's many others, you can feel free to reach out to me at podcast@matan.org.il, and I'm happy to send you some of the sources that we've spoken about today. Thank you so much, Nechama. Appreciate your Torah always.
It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.